Hello, this is Ben, and what we're going to do is take a look at the order of events in Genesis. Many people will happily grant to you that, it's possible for Genesis to allow for more time, and that the days in Genesis aren't necessarily 24 hours, but then they'll come back and say, but the order of events in Genesis doesn't line up with science. Now, this isn't true, and what we're going to do in this video is point out how this isn't true. In fact, it's so not true that I don't know how to put this. Genesis 1 actually makes a great outline if you want to help yourself learn the events that, in other words, if you want to learn the scientific story of how the earth formed, Genesis actually makes a great little outline to help you kind of get a concept of it. It fits it so well. All right. And the reason we think that it doesn't fit is, A, we don't really know the science. We're not really familiar with what the science is telling us. And so we think we know the science and we don't. Also, B, we're coming to this text making sort of the classic mistake in understanding ancient text. In other words, an ancient text was not written to you. If you're a Christian, you believe the Bible was inspired by God and that God saw to it that it was for you, but it wasn't written necessarily to you. So the core concept is that it is not going to answer questions that you're asking. It's going to answer questions that the people it was written to were asking. So in the case of Genesis 1, we come to Genesis 1 and we say, all right, this is a story about how God made everything. Because we live after thousands of years of history and the progress of monotheism, and we think that the idea that there's one God is not a new idea. We just want to know how God made everything. But Genesis 1 is not actually a story about how one God made everything. Genesis 1 is a story about, it's a story about how, not how the one God made everything, but that the one God made everything, I guess would make the point. In addition, in the original language, because remember it's not originally written in English, it's originally written in an ancient language. Not even modern Hebrew is close to, is the same as ancient Hebrew. And the point there is, it uses the names of ancient gods, or the Hebrew versions of the names, because people back then would have been familiar with those gods. And what he does is he goes down the list of ancient gods that people worshipped, and he says, this thing that you thought was a god, it's not really a god. So there's a tremendous amount of closeness with other creation stories. But what Genesis 1 does is it takes those other creation stories and it says, it goes through the list of things where this God did this and this God did that, and it says there's just one God, and he put those things that you think are gods, that's next God made this and next God made that. But here's the thing, it also perfectly lines up with the science. So it's quite interesting. And, someone once asked me, why do you believe, why should I believe that Genesis is literal? Maybe it's poetry. It fits so well with the mythology. And the point is, it fits so well with the science. It makes more sense to believe that it's, to take it as a literal story because of how well it fits with the science. So, with those points in mind, let's just dig right in. It says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. You can see it right there at the top of the page. So, that makes sense. The scientists are telling us that. That's exactly what they're telling us. I think it's 13.7 billion years ago. Sometimes I throw out the number wrong. But anyway, 13.7 billion years ago, boom, the universe begins existing. In other words, the Big Bang. Alright. Much, much later, the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. So, if you zoom in from the entire universe and you zoom into our solar system, it would have been just a giant gas cloud with rock and water and just one big fluid vapor gas floating in space. There would have been no light because there would have been no sun. And then the next thing it says is, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. So the sun is the most massive thing in our solar system, and it's essentially gravity. What it does is everything attracts each other with this weak force, but it's enough over time to eventually overcome other forces. And in the center of mass of this giant gas cloud would have been the truly biggest object in it that would have formed would have been the sun. And once the accretion of the sun would have caused enough pressure inside it, nuclear fusion would have started and there would have been light. Although the light would not have, it would have just been radiating out into a cloud around it. There wouldn't have been planets around the cloud. It just would have been, in other words, it wouldn't have been planets around the early sun. It just would have been a sun at the center of this cloud. But eventually, planets would have formed and accreted into their orbits around the cloud. But they would have taken time. So in other words, like, you get to the next thing. It says, and God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. So what has to happen for light and dark to separate on the earth? The earth has to go from being this big fluid cloud that, light just kind of seeps through to get solid enough so that one side is dark and one side is light. And then it has to start rotating. Okay? And so that would have been the next thing, formation of the sun, let there be light. Formation of the earth, separating the dark from the night. Now, and so God calls the light day, the darkness He calls night, evening and morning, the first day. And God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. So in other words, like, when it first formed and it was solid enough to block light on one side, it still would have been, everything would have been mixed up. Like, imagine if you have some water with a whole bunch of different stuff mixed up in it. Eventually the heavier stuff's going to settle to the bottom and the lighter stuff's going to go to the top. Well, imagine like all of the oxygen and CO2 and rocks and water and, all the different kind of rocks, gold, everything is all just mixed up in a big jumble. Eventually, the heavier stuff's going to pull to the center and the lighter stuff's going to come out. Well, the lighter gases oozing out to the outside of the center of mass, into the formation of the atmosphere would have been one of the first things. So in other words, that's one of the next things is like the lighter elements would go up. They would go out. They would immediately, go out as the heavier stuff went down. And that's what would have happened next. The separation of the waters that were under from the waters that were above, called the expanse heaven. Alright. Now, we skipped a little thing here, just to make a point. Way back in verse 2, it says, the earth was without form and void. Okay. This is a point that we miss because we live in 2017. But back then, the ancient Babylonians worshipped a chaos god called Tiamat, which I think every ancient religion worshipped a primordial chaos god. But the word here is Tehom, where, I can show you because we're on the Blue Letter Bible. So, if it'll load. Uh-oh, internet might not work. Ruh-roh. We're going to have to close that. There's bad weather today. You just have to take my word for it or look it up for yourself. Anyway, so the earth was without form and void. And so really, it literally says the earth was Tehom. So in other words, it's taking that primordial chaos god, Tiamat or Tehom, masculine, feminine version of the same thing. And it's saying, this thing that you worship as a god, this is when the God made that. And so understand that it's going to go down that list. And understand that the first, single-celled organisms and, primordial life, they get totally skipped in here. We've skipped over them. So we will skip over them. And it won't mention that. And you say, well, why doesn't it mention that? And this is the point. It's because it's not a story about how God made everything. It's a story about how there's one God that made everything. And so it's approaching this and thinking that the reader has questions about the different gods they worship, and it's putting those gods in order about how the one God made those things. In other words, it's talking about next the one God made this thing you think is a god, next the one God made that. And so it's going to skip over things that they didn't worship as gods. Because that's just not the point of the text. The point of the text is there's one God. In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth is the point of the text. Not, this is the story of how God made the world. Okay, so it just doesn't address our questions, it addresses other questions. So it'll skip over anything. It's not going to talk about dinosaurs, for example. Why would it talk about dinosaurs? No one knew what dinosaurs were or worshipped dinosaurs if they had gone extinct 65 million years ago. So that's important to keep in mind. But it will go to the next things that people worship. People worship the sky. People worship light. People worshipped this primordial chaos god. Okay? So you see how it works. Alright, so let's keep going. We got the sky, and then it says, and let the waters under the heavens be gathered into one place, and let light, dry ground appear. So that I do have some references for you on this. Here's an article. The early Earth this is from newscientist.com. This is the 8th of May 2017 article. Early Earth was covered in global ocean and had no mountains. So there you go. And so what happens is, yeah, the atmosphere is lighter and it comes out, but then the heavier elements still need to separate down below. And over time, we move from a flat Earth covered with water to an Earth that the heavier rocks go down towards the center of the Earth, and the lighter rocks come out, and so dry continents push up out of the water. And actually, what they're saying is now they think that the Earth cooled, and so some of the heavier rocks settled down. So the oceans kind of settled down, and then the continents kind of pushed up, and so that's how it happened. So, but the Earth was covered with water, according to the best we understand. Now, this is actually important, but for what we get to later, because of the big issue. But anyway, we have oceans and we have dry land, and so that's what happens. I think they had like a few small islands. It was almost entirely covered, was flat and almost entirely covered with water, and they're using geology to figure this out. Okay. Then the next thing the Bible says is let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit which is in their seed. Again, it skips a bunch of life forms all the way up to plants on land. But in terms of the scientific story, this is relevant. So, of course, people didn't worship, microcyanobacteria in the oceans, but they did worship plants on land. Now, it's important to understand, this is where everyone, says the Bible and science disagree. Because you're cool up to this point, then you have plants, and then after that you have the sun and the moon and the stars. And people say, well, that's a big problem. It's not really a big problem if you understand what's called the faint young sun paradox. And so you can look this up for yourself. But the faint young sun paradox is early in Earth's history, the sun's output would have been only 70% as intense as it is during the modern epoch in the environmental conditions of this time. Okay, so think about it. The best we understand about the sun is it would have been 70%. This would have been insufficient to maintain a liquid ocean. But we know from geological evidence that the Earth was covered with water. And so this creates the paradox that we have two things there shouldn't be a way to have a sun that's only 70% power and to have an Earth covered with water. Those two things don't fit. And so what they say is we must have had really, really, really intense covering of greenhouse gas. In fact, how thick was the covering of greenhouse gas? So we're back here. This is an older article, 19th of March 2012, where it's newscientist.com. It says London's famous smogs were nothing compared with the thick haze that enveloped Earth 2.5 billion years ago. The atmosphere at that time was rich in hydrocarbons, similar to Saturn's moon Titan. So you can look up, ideas of what, pictures of that. That's a good thing for you to Google. What does it look like from the surface of Saturn's moon Titan? And then we have, the big event. So, in other words, what the scientists are telling us is that on the early Earth, you wouldn't have been able to see the sun. It just would have been this giant, ridiculously cloudy sky that was essential to keeping the Earth warm enough for there to be water, because you needed all that greenhouse gas, but there wouldn't have been a sun in the sky. And so, the important thing to understand here is the combination of ancient mythology and science. yes, the atmosphere would have been opaque, but also understand that the ancient, people of the Bronze Age didn't worship a giant nuclear energy ball in the sky. They worshipped what they saw in the sky. And so what they saw in the sky as the sun and what they worshipped didn't appear until after plants did. Because the greenhouse gases of CO2 and methane, basically, would have been removed by the evolution and development of plants. Because plants take in CO2 and breathe out oxygen, and this is called the Great Oxygenation Event. So this is a big deal. And so you would have had, basically the Earth's atmosphere radically changes to being heavy in oxygen, and it would have caused the Huronian glaciation, which is the longest episode. They think it's the longest ice age. In other words, the Earth got much, much colder. The skies got much, much clearer. And some theorize that this would have caused the snowball Earth, that the Earth would have actually been completely covered with ice. And this would have been the first really massive extinction event in Earth's history. So actually, the science here fits. You would have had an opaque sky, and so what people worshipped as the sun and the moon and the stars didn't exist. It wasn't in its place. And then, when plants evolved, they would have cleared up the atmosphere, and that's when what people worshipped would have really came into place. Yes, there would have been a sun before that, but people didn't worship nuclear energy reactions in the sky. So the thing that people worshipped as gods didn't appear until after plants did. That's important to understand. Okay, so, and then we have the sun and the moon and the stars. Alright, so let's just keep going. Because then, there's other issues, like people say, how do you get, there's issues here. So the next thing is, it says, let the water swarm with living creatures and let birds fly above the earth and across the expanse of the heavens. And so people say, well, the waters would have already been filled with living creatures. And there already would have been tons of sea life in the water. In fact, it's this sea life that gave rise to the plant life on land. Well, after the Great Oxygenation Event is that's when you have what's called the Cambrian explosion. And essentially this is when you go from single-celled life into multi-celled life. And the waters would have started swarming with living creatures. There would have been, blah, blah, blah. You get the idea. But birds would have come much later. Much, 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 much later. But here's the thing. When it says let the water swarm with swarms of living creatures, they're not talking about multicellular organisms. They're talking about what people worshipped as gods back then. In other words, when it says living creatures, let's see if it'll bring it up for us. The term is literally, it's not going to bring it up. You're going to have to look it up for yourself because the internet's not working too great for me today. But anyway, when it says living creatures, the word is nephesh. It means something that breathes. So in other words, who's the god, who's the master of the sea? Dolphins, killer whales. Whales are the dominant creature in the sea. So in other words, this is the order of events. You skip a bunch of stuff till you get to the next thing that people worshipped as a god, which would have been the sea mammals. The sea mammals really do rule the sea. In fact, the scientists tell us that that's probably what happened to Megalodon, the gigantic shark that had teeth as big as a piece of pizza, a large pizza. And what happened? Whales working in groups like wolves with greater intelligence just dominated those things and would just ram them with their nose and kill them all. And they rule the sea to this day, whales do. In fact, I saw one woman had filmed the first ever video of an interaction between a killer whale and a great white shark, and the killer whale had its child with it, which sharks don't even raise their children, whereas whales have languages and communication. And the killer whale came up to it, the mama did, and she just flipped the shark over with its nose, and then it's so mentally, it couldn't understand being life as upside down and just stopped moving. It was just too confused. Whereas whales can do flips and things. They're truly the masters of the sea, and part of it has to do because they take in more better oxygen instead of pulling it out of water and chemically separating it, they take in pure oxygen from the air, because there's pure oxygen available in the air from what plants do. So they're the masters of the sea, and they were worshipped as gods, as the great sea creatures. Okay, it says living creatures means the ones that breathe water. Okay, and then birds were also worshipped as gods, and they would have come later too. So in other words, we've skipped over dinosaurs, we've skipped over the Cambrian explosion, we've skipped over a billion things. We got to the next thing that people worshipped as gods. So if we bring those 2 points to understand that this is talking about what people worshiped back then, and it's talking about how there's only one God that made that, but it's putting that in an outline, in a framework of the actual scientific story that's bang on. Okay, so anyway, alright, next we get to the land creatures, and it says livestock, creeping things, and beasts of the earth. So in other words, livestock's literally like, we all know that they worship goats and cows, and so we're going to skip over tons and tons and tons of land animals till we get to the livestock animals that people totally worship. And when it says creeping things, it doesn't mean like bugs or insects. That was a word back then for rodents. And then beasts of the earth, the wild animals, of course people worship wolves and jackals and all those different things, lions, And then it gets to humans, which came last. And the science also tells us that like everything would have been way, way, way before humans. Humans were fairly late. The best date I think we've got right now is about 100,000 years ago, but it kind of changes around. But either way, humans would have been recent. So anyway, that's the gist of the video, is that Genesis 1 doesn't fail to fit with the science at all, and it does go through the mythology that people had back then and just debunk it. Now, I guess the final point is that in the Babylonian creation story of the Enuma Elish, and understand that whenever a city conquered a city, they would rewrite the creation story about how the god of that city was the true master god, and the god of your city was defeated in the theogony in the god war. And so the Babylonians conquered the surrounding cities, and they said their creation story, where their god Marduk was the ultimate one, And all the gods complained. Well, the way it goes is Marduk put the sun and the stars in the sky to help make things, help run the earth, and then they complained about all the work they had to do, and so humans were created to be slaves. And this is interesting. Genesis goes right, it parallels the Enuma Elish, but it gives a different spin on everything. So in other words, in Genesis, the earth is created for humans, and everything's made ready for humans who are made in God's image, and it's all getting things ready for humans. And so instead of humans being an afterthought to do the extra work that nobody wants to do, instead of having this war between the gods, you have one God who has a plan the whole time, and humans are the culmination of that plan. And so this is, profound theological points that are being communicated here about how important we are to God, and this is a response to mythology of the time. That's clear if you're familiar with the stories of the time. And so you can't interpret this text and just ignore the questions that people had back then. We have to understand that this text was written in the Bronze Age, when the idea that there's one God was just a radically weird idea, and you had to really explain it and make it as clear as possible. So anyway, I hope this video makes sense.